What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Move is perhaps the best deck in the game. I believe there were 4 moves in the top 16 of the Golden Gauntlet. 3 made it to the top 8. A very powerful deck that bears the utmost respect among anyone who plays at the top level of this game. Move is perhaps the most versatile and powerful deck that exists in Marvel Snap in terms of point allocation and where those points end up going. There are so many potential points in this deck. There are so many places that they could go on the final turn, and there is so much that you have to consider when you play against this deck. Every game that you play with this move deck is almost certainly winnable if you have the correct reads on what your opponent will do. But by the same token, every game that you play against this move deck is also almost certainly winnable. The biggest reason why this can happen is that Human Torch is such an obvious lane winner that if you're able to fully avoid the Human Torch, then you can set yourself up to win the 2 lanes the Human Torch is not in. What sort of obfuscates this, though, is the nature of a move deck. It's very, very difficult for you to know where the Human Torch is going to end up, and a lot of these games are all winnable if you get your reads correct, but not necessarily winnable if you don't. Similarly, you can try to remove the Human Torch from the board by preventing it from getting big with a Mercury, or at the end of the game, stopping that from happening with a Shadow King. All of that is entirely possible too. Mercury is the most face-up and reasonable way to deal with this list. The other versions of things that are meant to deal with this, like dodging the Human Torch and playing Shadow King, require you to still have a good enough read on what's going on. Typically, the way to beat this deck is via Mercury. The other things are sort of tertiary, but because this deck is so good, it is notable that it has these weaknesses that it does. It's an incredibly good deck, but it's also an incredibly beatable deck, which is a really interesting spot for a really powerful deck to be in. Zapgaze won the Golden Gauntlet with this Cerebro 3 list. I deserve maybe 1% of the credit in that I encouraged him to play Cerebro 3 and put him in touch in a way with Jay Walla, who is the one who provided this exact list. Approximately the rest of the credit entirely is just due to Zapgaze's incredibly clean play. Cerebro 3 to me is a deeply underrated deck. I have rated it quite highly for a while now. Zapgaze was the only person playing Cerebro 3 in the entire Golden Gauntlet tournament. Relative to its power, this is a deck that is underplayed. I worry that this will change soon, but hey, maybe we'll finally get Cerebro nerfed, because I do think that this is a deck that really does operate on that scale. This deck is, in my mind, fairly comparable to old Hela, in a sort of unexpected way. The dynamics that this deck creates are that the point output that it has is pretty massive. It's hard to beat 36 in a couple of lanes, and because of that, it's also just a very difficult deck to actually deal with because you don't really have the ability to interact with those points in a meaningful way. Where something like afflicting the units would be good, this deck has Luke Cage. Where something like getting an Enchantress down on your cards, this would be good, this deck has Cosmo. It just has a lot of natural ways to make sure that you aren't actually impeded by any kind of interaction, and then just effectively hand dump all the points from your hand to the board in a very powerful way on the final turn of the game. This is also a deck that has the ability to intensify its draws against decks that aren't playing any of the stuff that can interact with it. Just throwing a Cerebro out there so you can Bastion it, get even more Cerebros, go above that 36 some of the time in those lanes. This is a strong deck that does powerful things with a lot of redundancy and very, very difficult to interact with it in a profitable way. I fully believe that Cerebro has reached the point where it is undisputedly one of the best decks in the game. Holding down the fort for mid-range gamers, a player named ACP put this list together, and frankly, it is one of the best constructed lists I have ever seen. I think this is exactly what the zombies list should look like. It has your disruption as necessary for various outcomes, but also I think what things people underrate about this list is This is a list that has way more disruption than you think, as long as you think of Mercury Cannonball as disruption. The other thing that I think people underrate about this list is they look at it and they say, oh, it's a zombie deck. Everyone's playing Shadow King. But you don't have to be a zombie giant man with Shadow King, lose to Shadow King Gamer. You can do Mercury Cannonball, move the Mercury, and then have a second Cannonball with your Absorbing Man. And that is about as many points as your zombie package play, and not nearly so vulnerable to Shadow King. So you have a lot of flexibility here. It just looks to me like the best constructed zombies list I've ever seen. ACP actually reached out to me and sent like a fairly detailed guide to what this deck is trying to do, where he really stressed how important Spider Ham was and how cool that was. So thank you for reaching out. He was a big fan of Spider Ham in part because of how combo heavy this meta is. We can't have a lot of whole coverage stuff, so Spider Ham is sort of a small version of, for example, Cosmic Ghost Rider, where I think it's fairly likely Spider Ham may get replaced by something like Deafening Chord when that comes out. That is still worth pointing out that this is sort of the version of that card that we have access to right now. It's a very solid list. I think it's really well constructed. I think it's doing a lot of smart things. And I think especially in a world where so many people are playing Mercury, it kind of makes a lot of sense to go away from Werewolf by Night when the two most played tech cards are Mercury and Shadow King, and it makes a ton of sense to build in a game plan that is a little bit more immune to Shadow King in the form of that Cannonball stuff that allows this deck to keep pace even with other mid-range decks that happen to have the tech card that is naturally good against it. I think Ongoing is an extremely powerful deck with a pretty uneven experience, and what I mean by that is if you draw one of your 3 2-drops by turn 2, you are in approximately every game you could possibly imagine. This is the deck that has the best willingness and ability to be a deck that has answers to whatever it is that you're going to see. You have Mercury built in, you have Mobius built in, you have Cosmo built in, you have a ton of play in a ton of different matchups. The matchups you end up losing are the ones where you just don't ever get off the ground early. You aren't able to do something that matters on turn 2, and you just get outpointed by whatever thing you're playing against because they had access to effectively 2 whole turns that you didn't have access to when you don't draw your 2s. It honestly, more than anything else, reminds me a lot of the old Silver Surfer decks. This is sort of what Surfer used to be. This deck that like lived and died with the relevance of its tech. We're in a metagame where the relevance of this tech is at an all-time high. It's a bunch of good stuff, right? But we do have more points than those old Surfer lists did because we need to be able to compete with some of the combo decks. This is also a deck that's benefiting a little bit from the reduction in Cosmic Ghost Rider that's been happening recently, because Cosmic Ghost Rider is naturally incredibly insanely good against someone who is playing a Moonstone deck. And a lot of our best draws are dependent on Moonstone. When you play this list, though, what really stuck out to me was just how many games felt so much better when you got your 2. I'm not going to sit here and do the math. I felt like that was so important to me that I would almost want to get a 4th 2 in here, but you run into a question of what would that 2 actually be and what would you cut? And then you start having to give yourself some really difficult questions that are really hard to answer. As is, this is a very powerful deck. It can go point for point with almost anything. It is probably the best combination of points and tech that exists in this metagame right now. The only other contender for best combination of points and tech, realistically, is the Supergiant deck. I think this deck has somehow become legitimately underrated, and I can't really tell you how or why that happened. I just think it's an incredibly solid point package mixed with some incredibly relevant things. This deck is just good. It is just a flat-out good deck. A lot of great points, a lot of great tech. I do not think that this deck has it in itself to be bad. I just don't think it's possible. If you have to play only Arishems, maybe this deck ends up coming up a little bit short. That's entirely possible. But honestly, against most matchups in this metagame, I view this deck as fairly similar to the ongoing deck, as fairly similar to the zombie deck. These are your mid-rangey interactive decks. Even though that might not be what they look like, if you've been playing Marvel Snap for a long time, this is sort of what mid-rangey interaction looks like right now, is those three decks. And I think that's just a really interesting metagame where these are all in the same sort of space, but they look so different from each other and function so different from each other, despite having, I would argue, not necessarily relatively similar matchups, but relatively similar arguments for why they exist. I think Mr. Negative is still in a fairly underrated spot. When I talked to Zapgaze, the two decks I recommended for like, this will give you a pretty good chance at getting a good finish, were Mr. Negative and Cerebro 3, because I just thought there were a lot of free wins available for those kind of decks right now, because they're very, very difficult to interact with in a meaningful way. And I think that Mr. Negative is in a very similar spot to Cerebro 3, where it's like, this is actually just a really good deck. Nobody is playing any of the stuff that beats it. You can do a ton of points. It is a little bit iffier than you'd think, because a ton of points is relative, and this deck has stressed various things at various times. But I do think that it kind of needs to build in the way that it is right here with more big hits, because you really don't want to put yourself in a situation where, like, you are Mr. Negative, you have popped off, but your Iron Man is in hand and costs 5, and you don't really have, like, enough things that can actually win the game. This version of it, with Zola, with Null, just has more big stuff coming down, so you're much more comfortable in your snaps, and that is a testament to just how big the metagame has gotten. It's not just that, like, there's ongoing decks playing, you know, Iron Man themselves. It's like people are playing Man Spider. There's just a bunch of stuff happening, and a lot of it is pretty big, and you want to be able to be sure that you are the biggest guy on the block. That's the premise of Mr. Negative, so you got to build to be the biggest guy on the block. I think this deck's really underrated, legit. Whereas this deck, I think, is properly rated, where it's definitely a thing you're gonna see. People are playing Man Spider decks, but I'm not convinced that Man Spider has been fully explored. I think there's probably some sort of energy cheat type thing that makes him a lot more profitable. Probably a different metagame could make him a lot more profitable too. The numbers this guy gets to are really big. You can do a bunch of ridiculous stuff with Man Spider. It's entirely possible. The problem you run into is you're usually just really ridiculously big in one lane. And you really need to be really ridiculously big in multiple lanes, because if you're really ridiculously big in one lane and then you Taskmaster, it's like, okay, that's cool. But everyone is used to that kind of game plan because they've been playing against Zombie Giant Man and Absorbing Man, right? They know how this goes. They know you blow up the Man Spider, Shadow King, Mercury Cannonball, whatever. Taskmaster doesn't work. We're done here, right? Like, that's the problem this deck has, is that it's so one note and open to interaction that it's very dangerous in terms of how are we going to make sure that we don't get totally blown out by anyone trying to interact with our really big guy. I think there's room for figuring that out in the, like, Pixie space, maybe in the Mr. Negative space. I'm not exactly sure. Pixie sticks out to me because Agony is a 1-drop and this is a 5-drop, and that deck wants a certain amount of 1-drops, and it definitely wants to be running Agony, and there's just, like, it feels like there's got to be something that allows us to do our points allocation on the final turn of the game and not on 5 into 6. Because on 5 into 6, it's just, we're a really good Shuri. We're like a better Shuri. There's a reason Shuri hasn't been good, and it's the way people can play against it. This is the thing that I'd be worried about in the future for Man Spider, is that there is no way for us to figure out a way to cheat enough energy to make it work. Teebs' Arishem list stuck out as a very well-constructed list in the Golden Gauntlet. It was not a surprise to see it get as far as second place. This is a very well-constructed, well-put-together, good metagame read list. There are a couple cards I want to talk about specifically. Spider-Punk, very good card. Also, soft anti-move tech. What you're trying to do is shrink a Human Torch before it can get too out of control. Even -2 power applied to that card at most points along the scaling up curve will or could be meaningful. Of course, the earlier it happens, the more meaningful that it is. Mercury, of course, everyone plays Mercury, everyone plays Shadow King. Arishem, one of the few places that can play all of them: Mercury, Shadow King, Cosmic Ghost Rider, Enchantress. A bunch of different answers to a bunch of different possible threats. It was notable in the final against Cerebro 3 that Cerebro 3's sort of invulnerability to tech really showed up. There were a lot of tech cards in this deck that did a lot of nothing in that matchup. That is sort of the hella comparison with Cerebro 3, where it's just like, I'm bigger than you. What Arishem really wants to do is bully out sort of the mid-rangey decks. It wants to go up against Supergiant. It wants to go up against zombies. It wants to just sort of generally say, I am bigger than you. Now, I'm not sure about the zombies matchup. I think that deck could very easily beat you, but you have the advantage of confusion on your side. They don't know what it is that you're doing. They don't know why you're snapping. You could be snapping anything, and that is what you have to leverage to beat those matchups. Especially, that becomes even more pronounced the more points are in your opponent's deck. You need to be leveraging surprise. You're playing against ongoing and you actually have your Enchantress, you probably have to snap it because that's not going to happen often, right? Like, there's just a lot of like, all right, I gotta be aggressively snapping in these matchups because otherwise it doesn't end up making a ton of sense to play a deck that has this much variance in it. If you want to just ignore everything your opponent is doing and say, if all of you are going to play, Mercury decks and Shadow King decks, I'm going to punish you for not playing Enchantress. I'm going to punish you for not playing Cosmic Ghost Rider. You can play the Splat deck, which is just a very solid Onslaught Prodigy combo deck. The goal here is to do something immensely stupid with exponential scaling and just win the game off of that. When you are playing against decks that cannot interact with you, you are in an incredibly dominant position. There are a couple different builds of this list. You see Spider Hand go in and out for something like a Black Cat in order to make sure that the Atom Warlock is drawing cards. I'm not sure how necessary that is. Spider Hand for information and for sometimes hitting the one card in their hand that could actually interact with us is a valuable addition to the list. This list is the king of exponential scaling. In a lot of combo-on-combo matchups, this deck will have more points than anything else. In much the same way as Mr. Negative is this kind of deck where it's just like, all right, I have one card that really beats me. The rest of this time, I'm the biggest guy on the block. This is a deck that is doing very similar stuff. If you can do something like Mr. Fantastic and an Onslaught, then you go Mercury the Onslaught, then you go, or not Mercury the Onslaught, Mystique the Onslaught, Prodigy the Onslaught. We're talking 3 Onslaughts in one lane on a Mr. Fantastic. We're talking hundreds of points. It's a very hard thing to beat, and you can just sort of set it up with impunity because people aren't really playing a lot of the stuff that could reasonably interact with it. Obviously, you have to be aware of more things than Mr. Negative. You have to be aware of Cannonball, you have to be aware of Enchantress, you have to be aware of Cosmic Ghost Rider, you have to be aware of Juggernaut, but there really are only a few things that you got to care about. This is one of those things you got to care about. This is ELA's build of Storm War Machine Legion, which I am featuring here instead of the heavier Dr. Doom build of Storm War Machine Legion because I like the way that this is a tempo deck. This deck plays a lot of things that are low to the ground and aggressive and gets ahead and does a bunch of really cool stuff, which makes it much more of a functional deck for those games where you need to be able to be a mid-rangey deck. It makes it a differently positioned deck to the Electro Blink versions of this list, where this is much more a mid-range deck that has the Storm War Machine Legion combo in it, and much less a deck that is explicitly just a big rampy deck with all of the things that synergize with what this deck is trying to do. This also means that this deck is able to fit in tech in a really powerful way. Cosmic Ghost Rider, Mercury, Juggernaut. These are cards that the rampy versions of the deck do not have meaningful access to, and that's the biggest advantage this deck gets to have. Victoria Hand is a very solid list right now. There's really not much else you can say about it. It's just a little bit underrated. A solid amount of points, a relevant amount of tech, some built-in scams with things like Quake, just naturally decent amount of power. The Quake could be a Mercury if you feel the need to make that happen. You have a Shadow King. You can cover a lot of ground with what this deck is trying to do. I am still playing the Agony. I have seen people, Heart of the Cards specifically, has switched it out for an Echo. Echo, one of the few cards that can actually meaningfully answer Cerebro, and I think that's a reasonable metagame call since Zapgaze just won the tournament. I think it's a very reasonable thing to be like, all right, well, nobody else has any answers to Cerebro. Vee Hand is actually one of the few decks that can play an Echo and feel good about it. And I think that might be a profitable direction to go. I like the Agony. I think it's cute. It's entirely possible that it's not worth the squeeze here if you can get an actual good matchup against Cerebro as a mid-range deck, because that's just not something a lot of mid-range decks can do. This deck is a work in progress, but much like the pitch for Cerebro 4 is largely that it gets to be a Mercury Shadow King deck hooked into a powerful engine of a game plan, I think that there might be something to that kind of thing in this space as well. This is, of course, a Mercury Shadow King deck hooked into a Jocasta multiplication game plan that I think is really sweet. It was cooked up by Smiz, however you want to pronounce it. It's actually Smiles. And I believe he and Roram played it in Golden Gauntlet. They're less confident in it in a Golden Gauntlet type scenario because it is a little bit fragile, but very confident in it on ladder right now, which is sort of why I've labeled it work in progress. I don't know if this is the exact right final 12 for this. I think it's an interesting way to go about it. I think there's cool stuff happening here. I also think that it's entirely possible we end up going back into like Invisible Woman stuff. I don't really know. The point is Jocasta's a really powerful engine, and this is a deck that can play Shadow King and Mercury, and there really aren't a lot of those. I instructed Pixie Chef to go see if there was anything to be done with Man Spider, but so far no dice. This is still where the Pixie guy is at, and I think it's a very solid list. 40-40, nothing to scoff at. There's nothing wrong with being a 40-40 deck, and what makes this deck good is that it can do 40-40 with a bunch of energy cheat and not worry about it later. You don't have to be in the way that Man Spider is sort of very much just the Shuri deck in the classical Shuri style. The deck with actual Shuri in it manages to be a deck that does not have those weaknesses because it can just fully turn 6 distribute the power thanks to Warlock and, of course, Pixie. That's the secret of this deck. It's that it gets to good amounts of points, great amounts of points even, while also not exposing its points to interaction. Pretty powerful thing to do. Destroy being at the end here feels a little bit criminal, right? Like, come on now. Destroy's actually a pretty good deck, but I tried to keep this edition of the best decks sort of really limited in scope to like, these are the actual best decks. I've noticed a bit of feedback where it's like, okay, Cam, you're kind of just talking about a lot of decks right here, and I don't want people to feel left out of the best decks, which is often why I do that. I'm trying out something a little bit different here, a little more in depth, and a little fewer decks. And so Destroy is actually going to be the last one here, not because Destroy is a bad deck or an honorable mention or anything like that, but because this is where sort of the end of like, these are extremely real respectable decks is. That's not to say that like every other deck is like tier 3 or anything like that. It's just that I think this is sort of the end of tier 1, and that's what I'm trying to make this video like. So this is what Destroy is. It's the same deck it's always been. The numbers are really good. The weaknesses are all the same. It's a very, very powerful deck though. Like, this is, if we talk about like, oh, the last video, we're kind of experiencing like point inflation right now. And the last deck in this video today is so much better than the last deck in this video 6 months ago. And that's really notable. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching the video. I don't know if y'all can tell, but my lighting is different today because one of my ring lights broke, and so I centered the other one. And I'm starting to wonder if you notice a difference, because when I look at this, what I see is I've been using incorrect lighting this entire time, and I should have been doing this the whole time. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. I'll see you in the next one.